Good evening. My name is Lawrence Berliner, and I want to welcome everybody to this evening's Zoom webinar, Finding Your Voice as a Parent in the Midst of the COVID Health Emergency and Crisis. We're continuing our series of presenting webinars because we are part of a community of concerned parents and advocates and professionals who are all learning together how to connect and get through these difficult times together. For the past school year and the previous one as well, we've been moderating a series of webinars to address issues that have come to the surface in this unprecedented time. We're dealing with an unprecedented school year that was preceded by another unprecedented school year. So we're all learning together and trying to come up with answers to many questions that we've been receiving. Where our children are physically attending school, they're involved with distance learning or a combination of hybrid learning. And we have seen a need to address a myriad of issues that impact your child's special education journey. We're here tonight to address questions, and hopefully we can provide some answers and share some successes and empower you for the road ahead. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. Our co-host is Jane Faherty, who is the director of JumpStart at the Stamford JCC, Jewish Community Center, and she's an educational advocate as well. Jane will give a little background about herself and what she does at JumpStart and as an advocate. And we are especially pleased to have Dr. Ronnie Cohen-Sandler, a private psychologist and author, as our guest speaker presenter. It's a roundtable discussion. And we're going to be discussing a variety of topics surrounding evaluations, independent evaluations, conducting evaluations during this COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected both school personnel and private practitioners' ability to complete evaluations, or conduct, I should say. They're completed, it's how they're conducted. How an independent or private evaluations differs from school-based testing. Quite possibly why more than ever we need private or independent evaluations. And there are some other topics that Dr. Cohen-Sandler will be discussing as well. But before we begin, there is a disclaimer. This webinar is being recorded. The information during this webinar does not constitute specific legal advice to you or establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, attorney Lawrence Berliner. It doesn't establish a psychologist-patient relationship between yourself and Dr. Cohen-Sandler as well. By signing up, you've agreed to receive information about future webinars and events from the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, myself, and Jane Faherty, the Stamford Jewish Community Center. Please note that Zoom, the platform we're using, is a third-party provider. It's not an agent or associated with the Stamford Jewish Community Center. It's not affiliated or associated with myself, attorney Lawrence Berliner, nor is it affiliated or associated with Dr. Cohen-Sandler. We encourage your questions. We have several questions that we've received prior to this evening's webinar. We ask that you keep your questions general. And please note, as I said before, this webinar is being recorded. So if you put your question in the chat format, that will be recorded. If you put your question in the Q&A format, it will not be recorded, and we can maintain your privacy to the extent possible. So we encourage that your questions be in the Q&A format. I think there's one thing to raise your hand. We're not using that. So please put your questions whenever possible in the Q&A format. If you look in the chat section on the screen, you will see our contact information, Jane Faherty, myself, and we have Dr. Cohen-Sandler's information as well. So before we begin, I wanted to just give a little background information on independent evaluations. School districts do evaluations, parents obtain private evaluations. But when you ask a school district to pay for a private evaluation, that becomes an independent evaluation. And our State Department of Education, and their website is ct.gov, has a set of guidelines, independent evaluation guidelines that are available, and it explains what the independent evaluations are. We have public evaluations, publicly funded evaluations, and we have private evaluations. If you're asking for an independent evaluation, it's because you disagree with the school district's evaluation. If you're asking the school district to pay for the private evaluation, you should be aware that the school district has two choices. They can say yes, they can say no. If they say no, they might file for a due process hearing. So it's always advisable to have as much information available in order to make that decision as to whether or not you want a publicly funded evaluation. Sometimes private insurance covers evaluation, not often, but sometimes, and sometimes parents use private resources. So I just wanted to give that little background. And some of this, there is some additional confusion, which I won't spend a lot of time on, because towards the middle of September, there was a Court of Appeals decision out of the Second Circuit, a Court of Appeals, which covers Connecticut, New York, and Vermont, entitled DS versus Trumbull Board of Education. So there's been some confusion in the field of independent evaluations, publicly funded independent evaluations. There will be more to come on this subject, because there'll be additional court hearings in the DS versus Trumbull Board of Education. So this concept is in a state of flux. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Jane, who will discuss the JumpStart program, her role and what she does. And after that, we'll have Dr. Cohen-Sandler talk a little bit about herself. And if you're on the computer, you'll see that she has a presentation that she'll go over. So I turn it over to Jane and Dr. Cohen-Sandler.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's nice to see everybody this evening. This is our last presentation of 2020. So we've made it through, we're nearly there. We've got a few more weeks to go. And it has been a challenging year for everybody, parents, children, and all of us involved in the field, this educational field. So I do work at the Stamford JCC. I oversee a program called JumpStart, which is predominantly for children, typically aged between 2 and 3, with developmental disabilities. But the disabilities might be more complicated and more medically involved to those that are more social, emotional communication. It really is a broad spectrum of children. And I then help those children transition into the public school. And I wear another hat. I then become an advocate, and I continue to advocate for those children throughout the school district, but also it doesn't stop just when they turn 3. I have some children that I advocate for now in middle school as well. Also at the Stamford JCC, we run programs for young adults. We have a really nice social recreational program we're running at the moment in person, following all the safety COVID protocols and guidelines. And in the summertime, we have a summer camp called Hand in Hand, which is for children aged between 3 up to about 10th grade. And this year we'll be doing a CIT program, which is something new that we're going to be embarking upon. I also have another hat where I look for community partnerships, one of which is, for example, doing these webinars with Lawrence, but another one we partnered up with STAR, and we do social, educational, recreational programming for parents and caregivers So if you check out our Facebook page called JumpStars, you'll see events that we have throughout the year. We're looking forward to the springtime when we hope we can have more in-person events. Right now we're virtual, but we do have some fun activities going on. But I'm sure that Lawrence and Ronnie can testify to the fact that things are not getting any easier for parents, even as we are becoming used to the routine of our school week and our school day. The challenges are not disappearing or getting any easier for either the parents or the children or the educators to that matter. So there is a lot of things happening on a daily basis. And it's really good today that we can have Ronnie here to talk about independent education evaluations, as they become a very valuable tool. They normally are, but I think in the time of COVID and trying to understand our children's capabilities and where they currently are, IEEs are becoming really useful tools for the parents to use and have access to. So it's great that Ronnie can be here tonight to talk more about these particular tools that are available. So welcome, Ronnie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'm already having a tech problem, which is that I can't get my computer to, let's see. Aha, I solved the problem. Many of you who are supervising students online every day may have these tech glitches. As you know, sometimes the students are exploiting these little glitches and saying that they can't get online and they can't possibly, or they don't know the schedule and things like that. But I didn't do that on purpose, I just want to say. So we're good to go here. And as you know, or you may know, that I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but many, many years ago, when I was in my training, I started doing neuropsych evaluations at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C., and that became my first love. And so even after I moved up to Connecticut in 1985, my private practice has been mostly doing psychoeducational and neuropsychological evaluations. It's just what I love to do. Attorney Berliner has been using the term unprecedented, and I have to echo that because I've been in practice more than 40 years, and not only are these unprecedented times, but I am getting a tremendous and unprecedented number of requests for evaluations right now. And I want to speak to some of the reasons why I think that's the case and how independent educational evaluations can be helpful to you as parents, as resources for you as you try to advocate for your kids. So I believe that schools are actually happy to outsource now. And one of the reasons is that I've talked to educators on every level, from college to nursery school, and they are all struggling to create more effective environments, learning environments for students. It is not easy. I'm hearing about educators working 12-hour days. They're exhausted. Then when they have students online, they're dealing with all sorts of difficulties and crises. And so I think it's important to understand, their perspective too. They're trying to do their best for students, and sometimes it's just not good enough for our students, particularly those with special needs, but many of them really are trying. So they have fewer resources for assessments right now. And if they're available at all, there are longer wait times. And so as an example, I was asked to do an independent evaluation on an 18-year-old student. And in the course of my doing this evaluation, the school contacted me and said, we can't get our speech and language person to do the speech and language part of it. Can you do that too? And I thought, well, that's never happened before. That's a new one.
Yeah.
So, one of the, I'm sure I'm telling you all stuff that you already know when I talk about the difficulties of remote learning. But it's an understatement to say that many students are not doing well with this kind of modality, either remote or the hybrid. And from a psychological perspective, it's because they're missing the structure of the school day. That's one thing which really helps them, the predictability. They're also getting a lot less social and emotional support, which is huge. Before the pandemic, a lot of preteens and teens were communicating and socializing mostly online, electronically. And a brilliant thing happened, which is when they were told that they couldn't get together, all of a sudden they realized how important it was to have these in-person connections. We'll see what happens after the pandemic, but they really are suffering from not getting that social and emotional support that they get just from being in school with each other. And so they're just not as motivated to sign into Zoom, which for many of them is equivalent to going to school. Okay. And as a high school child said to me the other day, the only reason I go to school is to see my friends.
Mhm.
And I think that she was speaking for many people. I'm sure you're hearing this. Now, it's the rare student who's doing better, but I do want to mention that because maybe you have that situation. And in my experience, the reason that some students are doing better is that these are the students who have social anxiety, for whom it's excruciating to walk into a classroom. And so they're just left alone to do their work, in the peace and quiet of their rooms, and they're happy as clams, but they're rare birds. So essentially, many students are hitting a wall. Pre-COVID, many students with special needs were struggling, as they often are, to kind of keep their heads above water. And now they're feeling as if they're drowning. And no child psychologically wants to feel that way. That is a recipe for being resistant to going to school, for being disengaged, distracted, unmotivated. The other thing is that students right now, on this mainly the remote model, they're not getting information the way they used to get it in the classroom. So for example, if they didn't know what was going on, they could observe their peers. They could even whisper a question to the child sitting next to them. They would hear other kids ask questions and maybe get their own questions answered that way. Or they would go up to the teacher quietly and ask the teacher something. None of that is available right now. And for some students who don't learn in traditional ways, they thrive on class discussions, on projects, on hands-on kind of work, and especially on getting up and moving around, which is something that you're not doing. Those of us who are sitting in front of a screen all day, it's just not easy to just get up and do something. So it's harder for kids to get differentiated instruction. And this is a huge problem. So as much as teachers may know that your child needs a certain kind of instruction or this child needs something else, they're really limited on what they're able to do over the computer. So most of that kind of learning is listening as opposed to reading to learn or doing activities to learn. And so kids who learn best from those modalities are kind of out in the cold. I took a seminar on executive function problems, especially for special needs kids, in May of this year, and it was eye-opening because it talked about the fact that so many kids have executive function issues anyway, but most of the kids with problems, whatever issues that they have, there's a component of executive function problems within those other diagnoses. And so sitting still, like inhibiting, managing their behavior, managing their emotions and their cognitive skills, initiating self-monitoring work, transitioning from one subject to another are exceedingly difficult. And on a more cognitive level, when teachers are trying to take kids from a very simple kind of concept to a more complex one, that's something where executive functioning issues will also inhibit them. Now, some of you may have students in high school or students in college, and unfortunately, the issues with remote learning during the pandemic do not stop at middle school. I have had a slew of college students that I'm evaluating, which is not that typical for me. And so I'll talk about the would-be college students for a moment. College application process is completely derailed. right now. They can't visit, they're limited in what they can do. I have some colleagues who are independent educational consultants, and one in particular, and I'm telling you this story because it will put things in perspective, but her specialty is helping students who are high-flying students to get into the most competitive schools. And she said, every year, my students have their entire application completed by Thanksgiving. No, I'm sorry. What's the other holiday? Halloween, the end of October. So I spoke with her just a week ago, and she said, you know what's happening this year? Nothing. Nothing's happening. They're doing nothing. They can't get it together. Not one student has gotten it together. So this is the kids who are supposedly functioning really well and who are really motivated. So I think that we should all take a deep breath and really have compassion for what kids are going through. So even if they're on campus already, a lot of college students aren't getting the accommodations that they need. They're most of the time, even if they're living on campus, they're attending classes remotely. They're not seeing their professors face to face. Their professors are hard to track down. They're not able to self-advocate. And loneliness, as we know, is the proverbial straw that has broken the camel's back for many of these students. They feel really disconnected. They start getting depressed, and then they stop even signing into their classes, and it becomes a downward spiral. So that's what I'm seeing. Now, in terms of the effect on parents, AKA homeschoolers, so if you have been struggling, which if you're attending this seminar, I would imagine that to some degree you've been having issues, know that you're not alone. It is not just you. Every parent I speak to, and I have spoken to since March, is struggling. I think it's really hard when we see what's going on, when it's right in front of us. You know, it's one thing when we know our kids are struggling in school and we're not seeing it every single hour of the day. But when we see what's going on, it's really hard to watch as a parent. It's very painful. There are all kinds of worries. Are kids falling too far behind? What's going to happen in their future? Are they going to be able to go to the next grade? We're confused about what to do. Most of all, we feel helpless. A lot of parents I talk to are feeling very blamed by the school because the school is saying, you have to make sure your kids are engaged. You know, you have to make sure that they are signing in, that they're engaged and all of that. Well, we can do what we can, but there's a limit. You know, you can, what is that expression? Drag the horse to water, but you can't make the horse drink, something like that. It's kind of like that. You can make sure they're signed on, but you can't make sure that they're paying attention, that they're not distracted, or they're not doing something on their phones. There's very little support out there for parents right now. And that, I think, is a huge problem. And
but
so
just to tag on to that, a lot of children with the IEPs might include cueing, verbal prompts, physical prompts, and those elements that help support a child throughout their day to access the curriculum and to do it and to meet their goals and objectives. And without those prompts, which typically require an adult to be sat by them or in close proximity or checking in at certain intervals, that's where the system is not supporting those children. That we need that in-person, consistent understanding from the adult. The parents might not understand what it means to do a verbal prompt versus a physical prompt, and when hand over hand or modeling is required, and when to take that step back. So those are some of the elements that are hindering our children at this time during COVID as well.
And if I
Absolutely.
just add to that, parent training is a related service that can be added to an IEP, and blaming the parents who are not trained to be teachers, psychologists, behaviorists, speech and language pathologists, physical therapists, and the list goes on, gets us nowhere. This is the school's responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility that could include training the parents on you know, behavior management techniques, the prompting that Jane just talked about. So these are, so I'm just saying blaming the parents gets us nowhere any more than blaming school for having the COVID-19 health emergency. So, you know, we all got in this together. We're all going to get out of this together. So that's the important.
And I want to say one other thing about the parents, which is that, you know, some parents have the ability to sit there while their children are on remote learning. Other parents don't have that opportunity. Many women I know are trying to work from home while their kids are in school online. And some of these students that I see, maybe their older sister or brother is trying to help them, and they surely haven't been trained. So not everybody has the same degree of resources available to them right now. And the expectation that parents are going to be able to drop everything and pay attention to multiple children and multiple children's education is unrealistic. So
I was going to say too, with the social side of things, you mentioned the loneliness and people feeling withdrawn and not having the ability to socialize. Quite often as well within an IEP, there might be goals and objectives to do with socialization and having appropriate peer interaction. By not having the opportunity to have those peers to model appropriate behavior with or appropriate interactions, and then to practice those skills with too, is also a really big hindrance at the moment, and is really causing some problems for a lot of children. As you said, not only within you know, the high school situation or the elementary and middle school, but also in the colleges as well, because they've got nobody to practice these independent social skills with now that they're on their own.
Exactly. And so one thing we haven't talked about much yet, but I think is really important, is that one of the emerging problems that we're seeing is that more mental health problems are parents and children are having to deal with more mental health problems as a result of the pandemic, and also the educational changes and inadequacies of the pandemic. So prior to COVID, anxiety and depression were on the rise among school children and teens from 6 to 17, astronomical increases. But since then, the research is demonstrating that the isolation and the anxiety about, you know, illness, about parents being on the front line, about all sorts of things, not seeing grandparents, isolation from family, friends, everything, it's exacerbating mental health issues, and in some cases, causing mental health issues. And so we talked about it a little bit before, but you know, many teens are missing out on rites of passage that are really important to them, and peer social events. And the thing about peer social events is twofold. One, they're missing out on these things to look forward to, the joyful things that we all like to look forward to. But also, they don't have as many outlets for stress. Sports may be curtailed or just eliminated entirely. They're not able to be outside that much with other children and play games. They just don't have those outlets that they had before. And so many parents are reporting symptoms, worrisome kind of things, like all of a sudden children are regressing and old problems are coming back, or they're having meltdowns, especially around work, schoolwork, sleep problems, eating problems, you name it. And so we have to recognize that that is part of this whole thing. Children are not just students, they're little human beings that have social and emotional needs. And I just came across these two studies and I wanted to mention because they're very significant. So ER visits is one of the ways that the CDC tracks pediatric mental health issues, because so many are seen in the emergency room. And from 2019 to 2020, just in this last year, as you can see, children from 5 to 11, there was a 24% increase in ER visits, and teenagers from 12 to 17, a 31% increase. Recently, there was a national survey of 3,300 high school students, and 1/3 said they were much more unhappy and depressed than usual this year, and half are uncertain about their future. There was also an article in the paper today, I believe, about, yes, today or maybe yesterday, about the number of applications to college for financial aid is plummeting. So that speaks to the fact that many students have disrupted plans and are not sure what they're going to do in their future, which is making them very, very anxious. So there are a number of reasons why 504s or IEP that have been in service suddenly are just not adequate. And you talked about so many reasons, Jane, in terms of the modifications and accommodations that kids need. But if you feel that your child is not accessing their education the way they should, like I had a young man who had a central auditory processing problem, and the school was expecting him to learn, by listening for hours and hours and hours on end. He was not accessing his education. That's an example of that. Or unable to benefit from the kinds of instruction that they were doing, whether it was all verbal and there was very little opportunity for visual aids and things like that. Or if you feel like there's more of a need for remediation or support, if you feel that executive functioning issues are so much worse when they're required to do so much work on their own, when they have to sort of self-regulate, when there's not the structure of the classroom and the teacher to help them do it. If you think that mental health issues now are rising to the point that they're now affecting the student and their ability to access their education, or maybe you just need to revisit the goals and modify and add things. Those are all reasons why you may think about a reevaluation or an independent educational evaluation. So Attorney Berliner can tell you from a legal perspective about, the difference between school testing versus an independent or private. I can speak to it from my perspective as a private practitioner. And I think of it as that the goals are different. The school, their goals are maybe narrower in that they have a mandate, and correct me if I'm wrong, the attorney, they have a mandate to determine whether students qualify for special education, right? And if they do, then they have to come up with goals and address these goals and measure them, right? Where my goal is totally different. My goal is sort of broader and more holistic in that I look at the whole child and I try to understand what's happening with this child, what's making them tick. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Whether there are subtle learning issues going on that the school has not identified, because sometimes that happens. Like if a student has ADHD, for example, they're kind of lumped in that basket, and it's, they don't really see what's going on with this child. It may be much more complex than that. There may be many other things that are creating a much more layered and nuanced picture, but they don't see that. And so I try to really get all of those factors and help people to understand how it's all fitting together. And that includes an emphasis on the children's social and emotional health and development. So I look at how they view themselves as learners and how that affects their ability to learn, how they process the social world, and how they deal with emotional issues, which so often accompanies all of these challenges, the academic challenges that they have. So personally, I like to look at qualitative information as well as quantitative. So, and this is another difference, I think, with schools, which are very numbers oriented. If the child fits in the average category, they're average, done, end of discussion. Well, the child can get to the average range lots of different ways. My job is to really observe, not just whether they get the right answer or not, which is less interesting to me than how they got there. What is their way of problem solving? What are the things that they're doing that are really working for them? And what's getting in their way? What's tripping them up? At what point do they just say, nope, can't do this, or they get frustrated, or they get fatigued, or they get down on themselves? What triggers that for them, and how can we kind of address that? So I think it's a much more in-depth kind of picture that parents get. And with that, there are more specific recommendations for success, not just, yes, we'll give them remediation in this way, in this reading, but really let's look at the whole picture of them as a child. So during a pandemic, the three of us were speaking before the webinar started tonight about all of the ways in which we have been changing, growing, learning, overwhelmed in terms of how we do our work. And it's been interesting for all of us. And for me, I started off, after my office reopened, I started off doing in-person evaluations. But it was very difficult and very unsatisfying because I realized after about 7 weeks that I didn't even know what these children looked like. You know, I realized I had no idea because they were wearing masks. I was wearing masks, and I couldn't see their facial expressions and read their emotions very well. And it was just very awkward, and it was actually interfering with the validity of the test, because when I was asking questions, some of which I was not supposed to repeat according to the standardized directions of the test, they weren't hearing me. And it wasn't their fault they weren't hearing me. They were listening, but my voice was muffled because of the mask. And so it was just kind of difficult. So in July, I learned all kinds of new technology to be able to do testing remotely. And it's actually worked very, very well. The advantages were surprising to me. So when I work with kids remotely, they are much more relaxed. There's something that they're just more relaxed because they're in their own bedrooms, or they're getting to use their parents' study or something. And they're home and they're wearing pajamas and it's all good. And the other thing is that I've discovered these incredible things. So I was working with one young man, a 13-year-old, and he's really struggling with school. And I said to him, what are those things on your desk? And they were 3,500 piece Legos of phenomenal, like rare sports cars or something that he had put together. I was shocked. And I said, let me see these. So he was, holding them up, and what a talent. Okay. And I knew right then and there was nothing wrong with his spatial relations. This is his integration of part-whole relationships. Fabulous. Another girl, lots of problems. She had these beautiful drawings on her wall. And I said, what are those? And she said, oh, I just kind of sketch, I like to sketch. They were astonishing, like fashion pictures. So I've learned, I get to know students in a different way, and it's very gratifying, and it's actually helped me in terms of my work. So what are the recommendations consist of? Well, as I said, definitely I get a more nuanced picture of students functioning and who they are. My recommendations are sometimes to revisit diagnoses and reclassify kids because I don't agree with how they're classified. I can make the case for more services, which I've been doing a lot of recently. Adding modifications and accommodations that can actually work in the remote environment. Highlighting additional challenges that students are having to communicate that to the school and have them be aware of that. Identifying strengths as resources too, which sometimes get lost in the shuffle, especially when kids aren't doing well. And sometimes asking for financial assistance. And I don't know if you have seen this at all. I'm asking Attorney Berliner at this point, but I've been able to get the school district to pay for one-on-one tutoring for some kids because they're unable to get it in school, which has been really, really nice.
Yeah, on rare occasions, we've been able to get in-home supports because the online learning is not working. The parents do not have as loving and as talented as they are, they just don't have, they're not the behaviorists, they're not trained, you know, for the prompts. So I have had a couple of cases where school districts have contracted, they won't use their employees for some reason, but they'll contract with a private provider to go into the home, and it's on a case-by-case basis. It's really what I'll call the out-of-box thinking, and whatever happened up until the middle of March of 2020, the whole world changed after that declaration of the COVID health emergency, and we're all learning. As I said before, we're all in this together, and we have to get out of this together. So it's better that we collaborate and work in the spirit of cooperation. That's for the school to the parents of the school, and that's going to help us serve our children, if we're parents, evaluators, lawyers, advocates, better, because the blame game gets us nowhere. Ronnie, I do have a question. Could you briefly explain the difference between a psychoeducational evaluation and a neuropsychological evaluation for those who may not be familiar with the differences?
Sure. That's a great question. So psychoeducational evaluations, it's actually not even a great term, but basically what we do there is we look at cognitive functioning. So we look at thinking, reasoning, and problem solving from a verbal perspective and a visual perspective. So that's cognitive abilities testing. And we also do achievement testing. And achievement testing consists of all sorts of different kinds of reading, recognizing words in isolation, using phonological awareness skills to decode unfamiliar words or words out of context, reading fluency, reading vocabulary, reading comprehension under different circumstances where you can look back at the text, you can't look back at the text, all sorts of different things, silent reading, reading aloud, writing, written expression is very important to me, whether it's writing words or completing sentences, combining sentences, writing short paragraphs, writing an essay. I always like to do a prompt and also a spontaneous writing sample. Math, mental math, calculations, math fluency, math concepts and applications. So that's generally what's covered under the achievement. And then the psychological part, which I always do, is really the social and emotional part. What is added with a neuropsychological evaluation are what's called neuropsychological part functions. And those include things like sensory processing, and not like from a PT perspective, an OT perspective, but sensory meaning visual processing versus auditory processing. And then language skills. So sometimes I do, receptive and expressive language skills. I also do social language for kids who are having issues with social cognition, attention, memory, executive functioning. So those are considered neuropsych part functions. That's what's added.
So we have a question here that says, in normal times, what is the role of the school for kids at risk of anxiety and depression? Evaluation finding in their case. So I guess what type of evaluations can you do for children that have or seem to be presenting with anxiety and depression? And is that an evaluation you'd expect the school to do, or is that something that you, as a private practitioner, would typically do?
Well, yeah. So let me say it this way. What the school does in situations like this is they use the BASC. Okay. Most of the time they use the BASC, and that is a survey that they give out. They give it to the parents, they give it to maybe several teachers, and many times they give it to the student, him or herself. And that presents a profile, if you will, of is the child at risk or in the clinical realm for things like attention problems or aggression or all sorts of things. And there are categories that have to do with emotional functioning, okay? And so that is an indirect way of getting this information, okay? You're basically getting other people's observations, which I think is fine, but it's limited. It's only one way of getting information. I don't do that kind of thing, okay? My job is to do more direct evaluation. And so there are lots of ways that I can get that kind of information from students. There are several different kinds of personality or social emotional tests, okay? One is direct, where it's objective, where I might give a depression questionnaire or an anxiety questionnaire to a middle schooler or a high school student, for example. Others are indirect, what's called projective. And the reason for that is that sometimes you have students who, for whatever reason, are crying for help and they endorse all of these symptoms and problems. And you really can't differentiate what's what. Or you get students who underreport. I have had a lot of that recently where students are like, I'm fine, everything's fine. And you know it's not. And so the projective tests are things where they don't know what you're looking for. And so you ask them to draw different things, or you ask them to tell stories, or you ask them to look at ink blots. And those tests, which are interesting and kind of fun for the kids, they have no idea, you know, what you're looking for, what's a good answer, what's a bad answer. And so it's important to me as a clinician never to use one instrument for anything. I mean, I was taught that day one of my program. So I always like to use a lot of different instruments so that I can get a high degree of confidence that there's consistency and I really know what's going on.
We had a couple of questions that came in before tonight's webinar that are not really on target with tonight's topic, so we'll address them. One person asked about their child who's 18 and trying to work on transition plans. And the question was, are there any resources? Dr. Cohen-Sandler doesn't do what I'll call a traditional transition assessment, where we're looking at interests, aptitude, strengths and weaknesses, trying to plan for life after high school, except for those students who clearly or used to have a clear track going off to college. So for this student who apparently is not going to college, the State Department of Education has a lot of resources. ct.gov is the state's website. If you have not received a transition bill of rights, you should have received a transition bill of rights starting at approximately age 15 or 16 that explains what a student with an IEP should have as part of their IEP. The State Department of Education also has a core transition skills assessment. And this is what the State Department of Education has as far as expectations for students prior to graduating from high school with a regular diploma or aging out of special education, which right now today is age 22, but it could be age 21. There's a federal court decision on appeal, but it's either age 21 or age 22. So it's important that you look at the State Department of Education's website, ct.gov, as a starting point. There's a lot of information on transition planning. There are specialists that do transition evaluations out there. Usually you start with the school district and their vocational coordinator, their transition planning, or if they have a contractor, they contract it out to a private individual organization. That's usually your starting point as far as identifying interests, preferences, strengths, weaknesses for furthering your child's education after high school, such as going to college or some other alternative, developing employment skills, or if they're going to require supports, identifying the supports, and if necessary, independent living. And that is if they need help to live independently, because we want our children as young adults to be as educated as possible, as employable as possible, and as independent as possible. And that's what we want for any high school graduate, but especially for students with IEPs.
So there's a question. I'm going to put this in two questions for both you, Ronnie, and Lawrence. So in our chat, we had just a basic question saying, what's the accommodation called for at-home tutoring support? And then they've gone on to ask, how can you get a district to pay for private tutoring if a child needs it? And I think that to you, Lawrence, is a question in terms of the legalities of that, but maybe to you, Ronnie, in terms of what tools and would it be advisable to do additional evaluations to determine a child's needs in order to use that to persuade or highlight to a district that you need those additional supports?
Well, as far as obtaining a private tutor for in-home supports or any kind of in-home supports, unfortunately, there has to be a history of failure. As Dr. Cohen-Sandler, talked about, there are students who actually enjoy online learning because they don't have to deal with the bullying and the harassment and the social drama going on in school, and they're happy as can be, with online learning. Out of all the clients I represent, I have 3, I can say that. Every other child, every other parent of the children whose children were attending public schools had small, medium, and large complaints, but especially the large complaints where you have a child. I have one client right now who has some very significant behavioral issues. He absolutely hates one staff person who insists that he meet with him every day, and the mom will log in and he will literally get up and walk away from the computer because he detests this person. It's nothing, I don't know the details, this is what I'm hearing. So finally, after months and weeks and several PPT meetings, threats of calling DCF for truancy and all this other stuff, I said, let's just dial back the rhetoric and just figure out what can we do to help this student. And finally, we had a calm discussion that maybe we can get in-home supports and see if the behavioral techniques, the incentives that were available in school could be replicated at home. It's not a perfect environment, but we have to start somewhere. And so finally, a month after that PPT meeting, it was yesterday or over the weekend, the parents sent me a consent form. What is this? I said, the school wants to release records to the private provider. I can't believe a month went by, but that's what happened. So in order to get the tutoring, you have to make the case that the online instruction is not working. This is, I'm a parent, I'm making myself available, I'm making my child available, but this is beyond my capacity. And you have to ask for it. You have to ask for it. If you have I just spoke to a parent this morning. There was a paraprofessional who was no longer employed by the school district that was looking for a job. So the parent hired the paraprofessional to be the child's tutor, to provide the online supports, the in-home supports for the online instruction. So it's the out-of-box thinking, it's the creativity that both the family and the school district need to employ, rather than say, we can't do this. No is not an answer, but that's often the answer. And so you have to make the case that let me back up one sentence. Your child is entitled to a free, appropriate public education. That was not repealed with the COVID-19 health emergency. Maybe the delivery of the IEP changed from in-person to hybrid or online instruction, but the same free, appropriate public education standard is there. So you have to make the case that your child is not receiving a free, appropriate public education. We're regressing. And one way to establish regressing is information that parents have who are doing the data collection every day that their child is at home, or also getting private evaluations. So you do an assessment and you compare the results to some previous assessment, which is a baseline. Are the arrows trending upwards, sideways, or worse, going downwards? And especially today, a lot of those arrows are going downward because the children are not in school. They're not getting the direct services they used to have. And layer on that all the anxiety, depression, multiple children going to different schools at the same time. There's only one parent in the house. It's not an easy situation, but the schools should be working with the families, not just blaming them. So that's what I would offer for that. And as far as the accommodation, I think you're referring to parent training. That's a related service. There was a question, what is the accommodation called? It's called parent training is a related service. Just like speech and language, occupational therapy, counseling, physical therapy, parent training is also a related service.
So Ronnie, this question is also for you, because you can also, the tools that you use can also be very valuable to parents to help highlight and demonstrate where a child's learning needs are, and to provide a baseline to see whether progress has been made or hasn't been made over a period of time, correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. However, what I would tell you is that by the time students get to me, it's pretty clear to everybody involved that the student is going in the wrong direction, okay? So I feel like there's another way in which I can be helpful, and which it gives me the data collection that you talked about just a moment ago. So it's the qualitative information that I spoke about before. I'm working one-on-one with the student, right? And so it's very important that I document what's happening in the course of my evaluation. Now, for example, when one test that's supposed to take 90 minutes takes me 2.5 hours, that's an important piece of information. And why it took 2.5 hours is very important for everybody to understand. So when I can go to a meeting and tell the school, look, in a one-to-one situation, this child is even having difficulties in a one-to-one situation. How were they supposed to function, in a Zoom? And I describe what I have to do, the supports and the scaffolding that I had to provide, just so the student could do the testing and respond and understand what was being asked of him, or the re-explanations that I had to do, the examples that I had to give, the timeouts that not timeout like in a behavioral way, but the rest I had to do because the child was getting so frustrated, or, whether it's emotional, whether it's an understanding, processing kind of thing, whether it's the fact that they can't initiate, whether it's the fact that they need step-by-step instruction. That is important data for the school. And when I can explain that to them, and give them vivid examples, then they're much more inclined, I think, to say, oh, okay, well, now we understand what's going on. And so this child needs more scaffolding.
I think this answers another question that was, you might be able to expand upon it, but I think by what you've just mentioned, answers a question that said, Dr. Cohen-Sandler, can you give an example of more subtle learning issues you mentioned you can assess? So I think in part you've answered that just now with all the nuances that you can pick up on during an evaluation that you can write with it and embed within the report. So you can go beyond just what the test was trying to elicit to actually more detailed nuances about that individual child and how they responded to the material, as well as yourself.
That's exactly right, because it's not usually that simple. So, for example, supposing a child has a reading disability, right? And they're designated as having a specific learning disability, but online they're having difficulty learning. And when I evaluate them, I see that there's such an expectation that they have built up that they're not going to be able to do something, that when I give them a new instruction, when it's a transition to something else, they look like a deer in headlights and they can't respond, and then they get very anxious and upset with themselves, and they make a lot of negative comments about themselves. And so it takes a long time each time this happens to kind of calm them down and to kind of reassure them, and then to repeat the instructions. And I know what they need, but this all takes time, and it takes one-on-one kind of thing. So it's not just that they're having difficulty translating symbols to sounds.
Looks like we have a couple of questions on dispute resolution. One is, what are the steps for a due process hearing if the IEP is not appropriate? I always advise parents to consult with an experienced attorney before contemplating a due process hearing, because the school districts are represented by very skilled legal practitioners. And it's very important. It's always a David and Goliath situation. And it's very important that parents understand what goes into a due process hearing. Almost all the time, there are a couple of exceptions, but almost all the times when parents represent themselves in a due process hearing, they lose. So that doesn't help with establishing a good constructive working relationship. So it's always advisable, from my point of view as an attorney, to have an evaluation such as Dr. Cohen-Sandler, to show where the IEP is not appropriate, provide that report to the school district at a PPT meeting, make your requests for add this, subtract this, reimburse me for this, so you have a clear record in the PPT summary. And if you can try to work it out by agreement, sometimes independent mediators are called upon to try to bridge between the parent's position and the school's position. Sometimes skilled negotiations by attorneys produces a desired result. But I would not willy-nilly just file for due process and hope for the best, because you can be rest assured that the school district will turn the request for a hearing over to their law firm, and then suddenly things become more contentious than they originally started. And another question within that, if something has been resolved through a complaint, and can that be part of mediation or a due process hearing? The State Department of Education has an informal complaint resolution procedure. That's what it's called, complaint resolution procedure. It's not a due process hearing. It's basically an investigation of a complaint. If the issue has been resolved in the complaint, then there should be no reason to go to mediation or a due process hearing. The State Department usually will enforce the CRP decision, or you can go to due process or mediation. But if you have signed a settlement agreement with the school district to resolve whatever issues are in dispute, and it's a full and final settlement, you can't relitigate those issues in a subsequent due process hearing or mediation. So it's always important to know what you've signed, that you fully understand what you're signing. Did you give up something? Are you getting something in return? So it's not an easy, it's a good question, but it's not an easy answer, because it depends. So you have due process hearings, which are trial-like hearings. You have mediation that the State Department of Education offers as a way to bridge the gap between a parent and a school district. Sometimes it works and it's successful, sometimes it's not. Same thing with due process hearing. One side wins, one side loses, except about 95% of the time, due process hearings are settled through negotiations, and that's the way it should be. Trying to find that middle ground between your position and the school district that works for you and works for the school district. Otherwise, there's not going to be an agreement.
I have another question for you here, Lawrence. When previous 504 or IEP plans are insufficient, how might parents request an independent educational evaluation from their school district? And what would that look like in the public schools versus the private schools?
That's a good question. The independent evaluation has nothing to do with the 504 plan or the IEP. The independent evaluation comes into play because if parents disagree with the school district evaluation. Typically, the school will do a multitude of evaluations to identify strengths and weaknesses, and they identify, and those identified strengths and weaknesses are placed in the present level of education and academic performance pages of the IEP. So if you disagree with the school's evaluation because it under-identifies your child, or it's not, I mean, I had an evaluation the other day, they had the wrong child's name. I don't know who they were writing about. So that was our tip-off right then and there that maybe we need an outside evaluation. As it turned out, it was just a typographical error, but it didn't otherwise affect the report. But my client and I, our initial instinct was to get an independent evaluation. So, so the IEP or the 504 plan is not what you're looking at. You're looking at whether you agree or disagree with the school's evaluation. And in this question, I don't know if we have enough information, because if a child is attending a private school, is that like a private prep school? Is it a private special ed school? Is this a unilateral placement? Is this a PPT placement at a private special ed school? So it depends. So if your child is eligible for special education or should be eligible for special education and you disagree with the school's evaluation, you have a right to request an independent evaluation. And as I said at the beginning, there are two types: a privately funded evaluation or a publicly funded. And usually schools could care less if you're going to pay for your own evaluation. But when you ask for a publicly funded independent evaluation with somebody like Dr. Cohen-Sandler or somebody else, maybe it's a speech and language evaluation or a physical therapy evaluation, the schools have a choice. They can say yes, and they'll grant that request, or they'll say no, and they'll file a request for a due process hearing against you to defend their evaluation, you meaning the parents.
Are you reading the same question I am, Florence, regarding OT evaluations?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
There's a child who's struggling with OT, and they're saying that the child has skills, but the family disagree and wondered if that would be grounds for an IEE, because they're wondering why they're still seeing their child struggle with OT. I'm guessing fine motor skills. So would it be advisable to request an IEE if the parents disagree with the school findings?
Yeah, the BOT is one assessment. And as Dr. Cohen pointed out, from a psychological perspective, you want multiple data points, not just a single test score that says average and we're shutting down any further assessment. You want to see how a child is functioning across all environments in a school setting. I mean, is there a problem with handwriting? OTs look at sensory integration issues, handwriting, typing, especially in today's technology world. I saw an OT report, the child is typing 8 words a minute. What's the goal? I think it was closer to 20 words a minute. Well, that child is going to have a problem with a laptop or any other device that requires keyboarding skills. So the law pretty much disfavors looking at a single test score to determine eligibility or service, and you look at a multitude of areas that will impact a child's education. And I might also add that the parents are also a good source of information, because parents see their children in multiple situations and settings, not just school. So if the school is saying the handwriting is fine at school, well, how come it looks like chicken scratch at home? What's happening in one environment versus the other? Or the child can read a mile a minute according to the school, but they can't read independently at home. What's going on? Why is the child able to do something in one setting and not the other? So it's not just a single test. It's not even a single test score that should be looked at. So
I have to say, it's one of the highlights of COVID that you've been privy as parents to having a glimpse of your children in a classroom, because your home has been the classroom. So where you might have been told in previous evaluations that your child has mastered a skill, but when they're in your home environment, they're not able to generalize that skill into your classroom, which is now your home environment, then it's not really mastered. So again, it goes back to things that Lawrence and I have been saying since the beginning: collect data, collect information on your child, whether it's written documentation to show what your child is able to do, whether it's you videoing aspects that your child cannot or hasn't done. So keep data, collect data, and relay and share that with your PPT team, with your teachers, so that you can really fine tune that IEP and make sure that it really is reflecting the goals and objectives that collaborative you feel your child should be working towards, and what skills they have mastered or what skills they still need to continue working towards. You are now in a position, if you are teaching and supporting them in the home environment, to have privy access to a glimpse of them performing in a classroom. Now your classroom is the home. Even if the teacher is teaching remotely, you are still having your child learn within your home environment, which is now the new classroom environment.
And that's what I said. Parents, especially today, are a very important source of information. If your child is completely on virtual learning or hybrid learning, you don't have to ask, how did your child do in school today? You were there, so you can see it.
Just as Ronnie said, it was fascinating for her to see a glimpse into the child's capabilities and skills, whether it was the Lego or whether it was the art wall, hanging up in the bedroom. So as challenging as this bit may be, we have to hold on to those pieces that we have found valuable, and hold on to those and use those elements and use that information to further the interest of our child and to help them at this time wherever we can.
We had a question about learning challenges. The child is not a, quote, typical learner, and the school has provided some learning materials but has failed because behaviors get in the way. It's sort of that chicken and the egg question. Do we work on the behaviors to get the academics to kick in? Do we work on the academics to get the behaviors to settle down? And this is really where a comprehensive evaluation comes into play, coupled with, if the child is learning at home, hybrid or full-time online, the parent data, because parents are a source of information, to bring it together. And if we need a comprehensive evaluation, that would be the direction to go, starting with a school district evaluation. If you disagree with that, an independent evaluation. So I don't know if we have any more questions that we haven't addressed, because I see it's a little past 8 o'clock. And as Jane said at the beginning of the webinar, this is our last webinar for 2020. So I want to especially thank Dr. Cohen-Sandler for participating this evening. Very thoughtful, informative presentation. And Jane and I will continue to watch what's out in the world of special education, and try to keep people up to date what's going on for this 2021 school year. There are changing decisions, court decisions, policy decisions, and we'll try our best to keep people informed through our webinars. Our next webinar is on January 12th. And our special guest will be Beth Sugarman, the head of school at Winston Preparatory School in Norwalk, and Michelle Roth, the admissions director at that school. And we're also welcoming Clay Kaufman, who is the head of school of a brand new high school called the Cedar School, for a high school for students with learning disabilities. It'd be located in Greenwich. which will be opening in the fall of 2021. And he'll be discussing his school and how it might be a resource for families who are looking for a high school program for students with learning disabilities, as Michelle Rolfe and Beth Sugarman will discuss the Winston Prep program and how it might be a resource for parents who are looking for elementary, middle, and high school programs for students with disabilities. We'll continue to have our roundtables periodically. We encourage your questions, and we'll try to address them as best we can, especially if they're targeted to the topic at hand. To register to learn more about these events, you can check our websites, Facebook page, the Stamford Jewish Community website and Facebook page, my own law office of Lawrence Berliner. And since we're in the holiday season, I want to take this opportunity to wish our guests and all the participants, whatever holiday you're celebrating, whether it's Christmas, Hanukkah, winter solstice, Kwanzaa, and I sincerely say this next one, a happy and a healthy new year. Leave it to, those are my concluding remarks, and I hope Jane and Dr. Cohen-Sandler can add to my remarks.
Concur. It's been a very difficult year, and I hope that we've offered some insight for you. We're going to continue to offer support during 2021. Check out JumpStart as well for social educational activities that we are offering as well. It will be virtual at this time. If you want any other information from Dr. Cohen-Sandler and you haven't been able to have access to that tonight, please either contact me, Lawrence, or Dr. Cohen directly. Her information is on the chat room. If you have any other ideas or suggestions of guest speakers or topics you would like Lawrence and I to explore next year, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll try and find specialists such as Dr. Cohen to come and have a conversation with us. So wishing you all a happy, healthy holiday and new year, and look forward to seeing you all in 2021. Stay healthy and stay happy.
Thank you.